You, all of you, you're too scared of being unpopular. You're not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that, you leave to the children, is the suffering of many that pay for the luxury of the few. You have run out of excuses, and we are running out of time. I mean, those were the words that Greta Thunberg, climate activist, spoke to a room full of people at the UN Climate Conference in December last year. It made headlines around the world. I mean, how did it feel to hear that? I felt shooken up the first time I heard it, and maybe you also felt shooken up hearing it from me just now. And if you felt impacted, imagine that you're an ambassador or a minister from a country of millions, maybe tens of millions of people. And let's be honest, if you are, you probably look like this. And you're hearing this, your leadership is being questioned by a 15-year-old girl with braided pigtails. Greta started as just one student striker and has become the face of a movement that has inspired more than 1 million young people and their allies to strike in over 123 countries and 2,000 cities in the world. And they've been protesting inaction on climate change by the current generation of leaders. On 15th of March, in my current hometown of Berlin, over 10,000 young people showed up for the climate strike, estimated million people who took this to the streets that day. And these Friday for Future strikes are emphasizing the need for equity, for justice beyond borders, for citizenry, and for humanity. And Greta said, memorably, if solutions within the system are so impossible to find, then maybe we need to change the system itself. And so I wonder, why are these the words that were covered by headlines around the world and covered by all major Western media outlets? What is it about this message that shook me up, has shaken you up, and actually the whole world? And it's because this message is disruptive. It's in fact a call for disruption, a disruption of not only our current economic functions, but also our current models of leadership. Disruption and change to bring about a better future, a more equitable, humane, and inclusive future is actually what youth leaders bring to the table. And it's this question of disruption I want you to keep in mind over the next 10 minutes. Because I'm actually not here to talk about Fridays for Future. I'm here to talk about the current human impacts of climate change that are being felt by men and women, boys and girls around the world today. I want to talk about a very important global development challenge, which is the impact of climate change on mobility of people, on human mobility. I want to share this question and then share with you why it is that I believe that climate change and migration are the two development issues that should not be discussed without talking about youth in the same breath. The impacts of climate change will be extremely disruptive for our future, yes, and not in the same way as Greta's message is disruptive for social progress. Climate change will be destabilizing in the sense that it affects people's ways of life, it affects people's livelihoods, our ways of understanding and engaging with the world around us, and also generations of shared cultural and social history. And this would be the case for you if you were from a small island developing state, like these two boys from Fiji who were affected by Cyclone Winston. Their ancestral home is now just meters away from the sea level, and seasonal tides are lapping at their doors. And by the time they're old, their house will be partially submerged in the water. Or it may be your case if you have been devastated by a cyclone, a hurricane, a flood, or perhaps a landslide, as was the case for the people who were displaced by the Commonwealth of Dominica, who I met in the Caribbean 2 weeks ago. They told me that after Hurricane Maria hit in 2017, it was as though a bomb had gone off in Roseau, and all of the houses were destroyed and all of the large trees were turned into driftwood. They call it ground zero. And the same thing was said by people who were affected by Hurricane Harvey or by Hurricane Katrina, and I point that out because it's important to know that natural disasters affect people in both rich and poor countries. Or it may be your case if you are losing your home to erosion, or perhaps it's being taken away from you by other communities, by big companies, or perhaps by for-profit-minded government policies. Or it may be that you're no longer able to predict seasonal patterns as you once were, and hot days and days without rain are becoming more and more common, while pasture land and water availability is less and less common. In Greta Thunberg's home country of Sweden, the indigenous Sami people are losing their reindeer herds because of drought and erratic precipitation Their reindeer are literally starving to get to death. And this is because in the poles of our Earth, the warming is twice the rate of the global average. Or maybe you're my friend Emmanuel Ole Kileli, who also is known by his friends as Emma, who you see here trying and actually failing to show me how to do a very cool guy pose. And I'll come back to him in a minute and tell you his story. So my research and what I'm here to talk about today is how climate change influences the movement of people. And while you may have heard about this in the media, you may have heard some overblown and very alarmist estimates of millions and millions of people affected by climate change who will be displaced or migrate in the future. So I'm here today to separate this fiction from the fact and then discuss why it is that the role of youth is so important in this question. And the examples that I just gave you of people affected by climate change are meant to illustrate the 5 pathways through which climate change will affect human mobility of people. And I hope I also demonstrated that these are types that are fluid and one does not necessarily exclude the other. So climate change will make it practically necessary for people to relocate from small island states, from riverine areas, from coastal areas, all of which are becoming dangerous as a result of climate change, as a result of sea level rise and frequent floods and storms. And it's the case that there are people from Alaska to Papua New Guinea who have been asking their governments to relocate them away from these imminent threats. Climate change will also force people to flee their homes because of the imminent threat of natural disaster. And we all know that climate change increases the intensity, the duration, and the frequency of these storms, as well as the long-term impacts over time. Climate change will also lead to the evacuation of people from areas that have been designated by the governments as uninhabitable, for example, areas that are unsafe, or perhaps areas that are being used for conservation efforts or for development projects. Climate change will add pressure to pre-existing fault lines and intercommunity tensions that can flare up and lead to conflicts, and you may have heard about this before as well. And finally, the pathway that I think is most important that I would like to talk about today is affecting people who live in resource-dependent communities in rural areas and are migrating, and their migration patterns are changing over time as a result of climate change. And this was the case for Emma, and I'll talk about it in a moment. So I work on dryness, drought, and land degradation and migration of rural communities in East Africa. By affecting water and pasture resources, climate change and climate extremes have already caused serious livelihood insecurity for farmers and livestock herders. And while migration is only one possible coping strategy among many, it may become more and more common in the future as it becomes more difficult to live a prosperous, safe, and dignified life in these areas that are increasingly affected by climate change impacts. And the negative impacts of climate change actually disproportionately affect poor and vulnerable communities who typically have limited coping strategies and sometimes even lack the social and financial resources to migrate away from hazards. So then they become trapped in areas that are unsafe. Poverty, socioeconomic marginalization, climate change, this creates kind of a toxic cocktail for rural families. And it's important to note that migration is not always a distress reaction to climate shocks and climate extremes. It can also be a proactive strategy to adapt to these changes, to diversify your income sources, to gain new knowledge and skills, and to thereby increase your resilience and that of your family. And migrating family members help this along by transferring important financial resources, by transferring knowledge and skills, and helping the community as a whole to meet the challenges of a changing world. And this is why for policymakers it's so important to create safe and dignified pathways for migration, because it's a win-win-win situation. The migrants themselves benefit, communities of destination benefit because migrants fill important labor shortages and contribute critical human capital, and origin communities benefit from these transfers of skills, knowledge, and financial resources. So now back to my friend Emma, who I met in Tanzania some years ago. Emma is from a dry corridor in East Africa, which means that average annual rainfall is only 700 millimeters. And if you couple a statistically significant decrease in the trend of total annual rainfall with an increase in an annual mean temperature of 1.4 degrees Celsius since 1950, you could say that this is an area that's significantly affected by climate change. And 1.4 degrees might not sound like a lot, but that's about a quarter of a degree every decade, which is actually a huge change. So scientists agree that greenhouse gases and deforestation as well as human impacts on land quality, has had a significant impact on availability of pasture and water resources, which affects farmers and livestock herders in areas like where Emma is from. And Emma is also a youth leader in the Maasai community. This means, well, he's from the Maasai. It's a group of pastoralist groups, one of the remaining that practices a traditional lifestyle of moving their livestock from one seasonal pasture land and water source to another. And before you think this is sort of an isolated example, I would let you know that by some estimates, 90% of meat production in East Africa is by pastoralists. He is the youngest of 7 brothers, which is actually kind of a small family for his community. And because pastoral groups like the Maasai are losing their pasture land to land degradation, which is accelerated by climate change, as well as to development projects supported by the government in many cases, he was not needed at home to be with livestock. So he migrated to Dar es Salaam to work as a security guard. And there he met somebody from Canada who helped him to learn English. And he migrated to Canada and ultimately got a master's degree. And today, Emma is the executive director of the Ereto Maasai Youth Organization, which is an organization that works on empowerment of pastoralist groups, recognition of their lifestyles, and also he does other projects like helping Maasai girls go to school. So meeting people like Emma, I realized that it was not enough to look at climate change and migration over 10, 20, 30 years and come out with these ridiculous estimates of people who are at risk of climate change and may or may not migrate. So in my work, I combine these environmental and climate factors with important social, cultural, and economic factors, as well as the political barriers that we know are important in migration decisions. And because I think Emma's story really epitomizes how people can use migration to adapt to the changes around them, to give back to their communities, and indeed migration can be a sort of vehicle for all of this, as well as to find the tools to build resilience in all of the communities that you're a part of. So I'm doing this research because I think it would be important for governments to be able to identify groups that need support, help people to migrate by choice and not because they have to, out of distress. And also, governments should prepare for the inevitable, because climate change will affect migration, for example, by building resilience in urban areas where many people move to. So, coming to the youth factor, as I am, after all, interested in that. Why is it that youth like Emma are so important to my research, and why is it that youth leaders are so important in migration policy? Well, 1 in 3 people on the move are under the age of 30. That includes refugees, migrants, and displaced people. And as for migrant workers, 1 in 9 are between the ages of 15 and 24. So lots of youth in migration. And the share of migrants under 30 is growing over time. And we have research suggesting that young people are actually more interested in migrating than older generations. They have a higher propensity for migration, so we can think that this trend will probably increase over time. So governments, of course, want to know, why are youth migrating? Well, they're migrating for love, to start businesses, for school. They're migrating to use their new skills. They're migrating for work. They're looking for new experiences, sometimes for adventure. I myself have migrated internationally many times for many of these reasons as well. And we also know that household resources and attributes are part of household planning. Families take decisions together. So when faced with a climate shock or with drought or with crop failure, it's very often youth who are the ones who move, youth of working age, because they have a relatively lower social status in their communities and fewer anchors at home, like fewer children and elderly parents to take care of. They have fewer productive assets, fewer community obligations, and so on. So ultimately, this social and political exclusion and marginalization that's experienced by youth contribute to the reasons why they migrate, as well as to the reasons why they ultimately become subjected to exploitation, discrimination, and abuses. And unfortunately, women and girls are disproportionately affected by some forms of violence. So this is why in times of distress, income loss or perhaps a drought-induced crop failure is very often the young people who migrate to help their families cope in the short term and adapt in the long term. But thankfully, young people are also on the front lines of dealing with migration after it happens, in the sense that they're working on social inclusion, they're working on integration in cities, they're starting humanitarian NGOs, they're all over migration. Just very hopeful, I think. So coming back to the million climate strikers and the powerful message therein, if solutions within the system are so impossible to find, then we must change the system itself. So why is this message so powerful and so disruptive? Well, first of all, because it kind of calls us all out. I mean, it's right. We need to wake up to the reality of climate change, and we can't continue business as usual as we have been doing. It's too dangerous. Scientists say we have less than 12 years to get back on track. It's time to act. And in part, this is a powerful message because we're not used to seeing 15, now 16-year-old girls occupying the stages that used to be exclusively occupied by old white men. And I think we should be thankful for this. We should get ready for more of that. And it's not just Greta's presence at the UN that is disruptive and powerful. It's this explicit questioning of the authority and representativeness of people who have been working in decades for these institutions that are centuries old. And by this, I don't mean to question the European values that were mentioned by a previous speaker, or liberalism. I'm really just talking about the failure of many of our leaders to genuinely and repeatedly have youth participation in decision-making, have women participate, have people of color, people with disabilities, etc. This is something that needs to change. And this message is in part powerful because the implication of this call to action is questioning some of the very foundations of our societies and of our economies, and really of capitalism itself. And these are some of the building blocks of what you and I do on a daily basis. So it's challenging our deepest and least examined beliefs. And we're beginning to learn that our economy is kind of like a get-rich-quick scheme in which the environmental liability is pushed onto people who won't be able to reap the rewards and had nothing to do with creating the damage. This is daylight robbery, the climate strikers say. You're stealing our future. So if the solutions can't be found in the system, then you must change the system itself. So as we, and many people around the world, begin to confront this reality of building a better, more inclusive, but kind of upside-down future, I think we need to also question, how do we include migration in this future? We have to question our own assumptions. We have to challenge the political narrative that migration is something that needs to be more controlled or reduced. We need to acknowledge that migration is a powerful, positive, social, cultural force, which can improve the lives of people who are migrating, lives of their families, and of course of the destination areas receiving those migrants. And the migration of youth is not only a growing reality, it may be one of the best and most equitably oriented, transformative, and culturally acceptable solutions to climate change impacts that we have. And young people are what I like to call sustainable development natives, much in the same way that people who grew up with the internet are called digital natives. And that's because we grew up in an environment in which the principles and values of sustainable development are in us, we embody them. Inclusiveness, diversity, these are things that young people care deeply about. And so migration solutions are likely to come from this new generation of leaders, and in fact already have. The Global Compact on Migration, which was just adopted by a majority of UN member states in December, was basically written by young people, researched and written by people working for their governments, young people. And it's a roadmap for governments. It assembles previously agreed human rights documents as well as migration agreements, but it also provides practical and actionable solutions. And one such example is a global skills partnership that would be working with the private sector to bring skills trainings to people in migrant sending countries, to train and educate people who may migrate as well as people who may not, and match those people with countries who have immediate labor needs that they can fill. If migration solutions come from the new generation of leaders, I'm quite hopeful. I'm also very hopeful for a future that is peaceful, just, and inclusive. And it's in part because if the old generation of leaders looks like this, but the new generation of leaders looks like this, and like this. Thank you very much.